The construction of reality. Jacobo Grinberg. Introduction. The world as we perceive it results from the activation of our brain cells. This assertion is the thesis on which this work is based. Furthermore, the only difference between the physical world and the world of our dreams is in terms of whether the stimuli that activate these cells do so through our sensory organs, external stimuli, or through internal activation, internal stimuli. Both the reality we call external and the one we call internal are a construction that depends on us and, as such, is modifiable. The world and its reality are a description that depends, in its characteristics, on our genetic makeup and our personal history. We cannot change our genetic makeup for now, but we can modify our history. In that instant, the description changes, and the change sets us free. This book is not intended to be an objective and irrefutable demonstration of the above considerations. It is merely a stimulus that will bring about changes in some, and not in others. Let the reader learn from reading it that it will not depend on the words written here, but on himself. For me, it has been a delight to write it, and with that I am satisfied. I would like to thank the National Council for Science and Technology CONACYT and its director, Gerardo Bueno Zirion, for their support in the completion of this work. The universe has as many centers as living beings. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Nothing happens when time passes. Octavio Paz. To understand something, it is first necessary to let it be born. No. By J. Garcia Zuazua. Seeing the light is a constant challenge. When we see it, we don't believe it because we think it's not easy, and so we continue blindly along the path. Lazaro Brainer. The construction. The lamp made the inert body shine. The operating room smelled clean, mixed with ether and acetone. The cut was still in place. The femoral artery had been ligated, and the risk of hemorrhage had passed. The surgical saw was emitting bone dust and ozone. The injection of the anesthetic had been the most terrible. Lanil had almost resisted, but the memory of the pain was stronger than the terror of losing his leg. The moment the amber liquid penetrated his veins, he knew that it was no longer possible to go back. The sensation of the wind hitting his face was delightful. The speed such that he almost felt like flying. Riding the motorcycle made Lanil feel like nothing was more powerful than him. The asphalt seemed to disappear beneath the wheels, and the landscape moved backward at a dizzying, fantastic pace. Man, thought Lanil, should always feel like this, master of himself and his machine, never an object and effect of it. The road curves gently and ascended at a gentle incline. Lanil had all his camping gear. He planned to reach the snowy mountain at dusk and set up his tent at the foot of the icy mass. The climb would begin at dawn. It would be the ultimate delight to reach the heights, feeling like the entire planet was supporting him. Lanil didn't see the trailer. The impact was so terrible that his body was thrown out, and after flying 30 meters, he fell into a hollow. The doctors couldn't explain the miracle. There was an open fracture in his leg, but other than that and some scrapes, the injured man was fine. It was a real pain to walk around with his leg in a cast, even though it was only 3 months away from being removed, and the inability to run, climb mountains, or ride a motorcycle was exasperating. But all of this was nothing compared to the constant tickling and the desire to make it go away. The infection had started after that cursed night when, driven mad by the tickling, Lanil had taken a long needle and, inserting it between his skin and the cast, had scratched the wound. The pain was excruciating, like 1,000 fires penetrating my knee, never ending or subsiding. No antibiotics or other treatments worked. The pain persisted as if someone outside was stirring it up and intensifying it. There was no escape, no refuge, even sleep was hell. The few times Lanil managed to fall asleep, His dreams were plagued by little devils who, with large knives, stabbed his knee in an endless procession. Lanil became a knee. There was no other thought, idea, or sensation but the pain in his knee. In his knee, always in his knee. 6 months had passed since that night, and the pain remained the same, although it had transformed from burning to stabbing. Waves rose and fell 10 times a minute. Lanil had counted them thousands of times. It was dramatic to hear that sick being always screaming at that frequency. Lanil didn't understand why the doctors couldn't ease his pain. He had gone to the best specialists and none had been able to do anything. The only thing that gave Lanil any help was morphine. They had been very careful not to make him addicted, injecting him with very small doses and only when absolutely necessary. But, as expected, Lanil needed the drug more and more frequently. Desperate with the pain, with his acquired addiction, and with the frustration of medical treatments, Lanil decided to try other methods. The road to the mountains began in that deserted, dusty town. Everything was brown, from the streets and houses to the clothes of the inhabitants. Lanil had injected himself with morphine 2 hours earlier and was dozing in the back seat of the jeep. The driver began the ascent. The trench was under construction, and the earth loosened by the workers' shovels and bulldozers soon covered the roof and windshield of the rover with a dark layer. After 3 hours of travel, jungle vegetation began to appear, the air became humid, and the mist made it impossible to see the abyss that bordered the road. The jeep began to lurch, and Lanil suddenly began to wake up. The landscape was breathtaking. The ferns and trees formed a dark, damp tunnel along which they traveled. At times, through a clearing in the jungle, a valley could be seen that, from that height, seemed to be made up of perfect geometric shapes in different shades of green. Lanil momentarily forgot his pain and was captivated by the view. He remembered his days as a mountaineer and felt a great nostalgia. Man, he thought, was born to always see things from that height. The world was wonderful, and anyone who didn't know how to enjoy it while being healthy was a perfect animal. Lanil hadn't felt this well in a long time. He remembered going to see doctors who promised him the long-awaited cure. He'd always had hope, but he'd never been as certain as he was at that moment. While it was true that he didn't know the mountain witch doctor, he had heard of miraculous cures performed by this shaman, whom some considered almost a saint. The jeep fell into a hole, and the impact on the rear wheel was so great that Lanil forgot all his reasoning and began to scream in pain. Desperate, he shouted at the driver to stop, and Lanil obeyed, and after a frantic search, he found the syringe. He would never have injected twice in such a short period of time, but he was in such pain that he didn't care about the possible consequences. The landscape began to turn red, the trees threw their branches in all directions, and the gap resembled a river of phosphorescent lava slithering like an enormous snake. The valley was a gigantic chessboard, covered by a violet dome filled with large windows. Lanil leaned through one and moved glass chess pieces shaped like knees. The game would be one of life or death. Each move of the pieces had to be made with the utmost care and after deep reflection. The opening was magnificent, and his opponent, that gigantic fern, spent an eternity pondering before daring to move his pawn. Lanil attacked with his knights. He had to kill the king, or else all the pieces would kill him. They arrived at dusk. Lanil was still asleep, and the driver, familiar with the mountains, headed the jeep in the direction of the witch doctor's house. The hut was dark, and the smoke from the bonfire stove penetrated Lanil's lungs. The flames painted the shaman's face orange, and his long grey braids gave him a ghostly appearance. Lanil pointed to his bad knee and exaggerated a gesture of pain, hoping the smoke-shrouded figure would understand. The witch doctor approached Lanil and, with a very gentle movement, exposed the painful area. He observed it closely for a long moment, then left the hut. Lanil looked at the driver, who nodded. After half an hour, the sorcerer appeared carrying a clay cup and several other vessels. He pointed out a mat to Lanil, and Lanil, understanding, lay down on it. The shaman took a burning ember from the fire and held it to the clay cup. Almost instantly, the room was filled with a bittersweet smell reminiscent of incense. The chant that followed had no melody, only a shifting rhythm repeated at isochronous intervals. From a container, the shaman extracted a black powder that he scattered around Lanil's knee, all the while observing Lanil's eyes directly. After sprinkling that powder substance, touched the sick man's knee, and with a sure but gentle movement, began to rub it without taking his eyes off the sufferer. The latter, who had never endured the contact of a hand on his knee, was surprised to feel no pain and almost reflexively smiled at the shaman. The shaman, as his only response, made a gesture of contempt. Lanil was pierced from the tip of his foot to the vertex. A sensation of intense cold began to fill him, and his leg began to tremble. The pain that followed the contemptuous look was indescribable. Lanil writhed on the mat and began to howl. The shaman, without hurrying, took Lanil by the shoulders and smiled at him. Instantly, the pain disappeared. The shaman pointed to Lanil's knee, then indicated his heart and head, extinguished the fire in the clay cup, and said goodbye without saying a single word. The return trip was even more terrible and painful than the one he had come back. Lanil felt he had never hated anyone as much as he hated that witch doctor. All the suffering of the journey was only to hear some chants, smell incense, and then be pointed at on his knee, his heart, and his head. It was a farce, and if that wretched shaman thought he had cured him, he was completely wrong. The pain continued, as intense as or even more intense than before. It continued. Damn it, it continued. The office was very well equipped. Lanil felt confident. He was surely a good doctor, at least his name was well known. I understand, the doctor said, that the decision is very difficult, but after so many months of suffering and so many failed treatments, I'm afraid there's no other choice. I don't want to deceive you. You probably won't be able to climb mountains anymore, but with the new support devices, you'll learn to walk almost as well as before, and you won't feel any pain anymore. The operation had lasted 6 hours, and, considering its seriousness, had been a complete success. Lanil would remain asleep for a week, during which time the morphine dosage would be gradually reduced. This, the doctors believed, would spare the patient unnecessary pain, and also help him kick his addiction to the drug. When Lanil woke up, the first thing he did was check if it had all been a bad dream. He lifted the sheet and was petrified with terror. His right leg was gone. Everything went well for the next 2 weeks, but one night Lanil had a dream that left such a lasting impression on him that he woke up drenched in sweat. He had felt a tickle on his right knee. The following nights were tormenting. The dream kept recurring, and little by little, the tickle turned into pain, first burning, then stabbing. And so it was that night turned into day. Lanil felt with horror that his knee was still there. The sensation as clear and real as if his leg hadn't been amputated. It wasn't just in dreams anymore. Lanil became a knee again, every minute of every day. And it happened that Lanil's cries were repeated with a frequency of 10 per minute. And it happened that Lanil understood and pointed to his missing knee, his heart and his head. Internal. It was customary to get up early and go for a walk along the cobblestone streets. The fresh air was thick with the scent of dew, damp earth and wet straw. At the end of the street the hills began. From its heights you could see the roofs of the small houses that made up the town. Reddish corrugated roofs surrounded the cobblestone streets. Karanitis made the journey every day. Upon reaching the mountain, he sat on a rock and stared into space, thinking. The day before, something very strange had happened to him. After spending the entire night heating the mixture and adding the necessary substances for the transmutation, he realized that the goal wasn't to transform the substance into gold. He remembered the look on Porneus's face, his assistant. The eyes were wide open, expectant, focusing on him. Kyrenius had noticed that Porneus was looking at him, and that this vision must be very different from the vision he had of himself when his image was reflected in the mirror. It was obvious. Turning the mixture into gold was just a gain compared to being able to become his assistant and thus see himself. It must be magnificent to have Porneus's vision with the Kyrenitus's experience. He would learn more about himself, much more than by dedicating himself to making gold. Kyrenitus rose from the rock and breathed in the mountain air, feeling alive and as if he had just woken from a long sleep. The problem was not easy to solve. It could not be heated or cooled itself, like the mixture, to wait for the transformation. Nor could acid be added or evaporated. The method had to be different. Kyrenitus was very patient. Every alchemist had to learn to be patient, otherwise nothing would be achieved. That is why he was not frightened by the prospect of having to wait a long time before finding the solution. First, it occurred to him that in order to see himself through Porneus's eyes, he should know him well. For 2 years the assistant suffered the most thorough interrogation on record, but to no avail. Later, Kyrenitus had an idea. He would sit in front of his mirror, metallic, and would try to see his own eyes. This would surely bring the moment closer. Porneus couldn't understand how anyone could spend so much time in front of a mirror. He began to doubt his master's health, and, like the rest of the village, to think that Kyrenius was going mad. After a year of standing in front of the mirror, all Kyrenius got was a splitting headache, so he abandoned that method. One night, Kyrenius had a dream. He saw Paracelsus coming into his laboratory with a large flask in his hands. Kyrenitus knew that Paracelsus was the greatest alchemist of all time, so he dared to ask him the meaning of the flask. Paracelsus looked him in the eyes and, with a delicate movement, he dropped the flask on the floor, shattering it. Kyrenius woke up sweating. Every act of Paracelsus had a profound meaning. Destroying the flask, even if it was a dream, was a lesson he had to try to understand. For 10 days, Kyrenius lived on the mountain, meditating on his dream. He thought that by destroying the flask, Paracelsus had meant to tell him that although alchemy was only a path, he must follow it completely before reaching his destination, that once he had done so, he could destroy the tool, but not before. It was very obvious. Interrogating Porneus or looking in the mirror would achieve nothing. He had to return to his work. The fire had been burning for 7 years, and nothing had happened. Kyrenitus was reaching such a level of despair that he felt he was going to explode. He had searched for 10 years, and absolutely nothing had happened. He had found no gold, nor had he transformed himself. Kyrenius took an axe and began destroying his life's work. When he finished, he headed into the mountains, determined to live as a hermit. The cave was cool, the entrance surrounded by vines, and a large rock partially obstructed it. Kyrenius had found it after walking through the forest for 2 days and 2 nights. He cut branches and leaves from the nearby trees and placed them at the bottom. That would be his bed. He found a birch log and, with his own hands, removed the bark, carried it to the cave, and with great difficulty placed it in the center. That would be his table, and it would remind him that the center is the essence. At least that's what he had learned as an alchemist. The nights were placid, the only sounds being the murmur of the brook and the chirping of crickets. At 6 in the morning, a ray of orange light entered, and seemed to move along the floor of the cave, and that the moment it touched Kyrenitus's face it made him wake up. There was no metal mirror, no flasks, no fires, no Porneus. Kyrenitus spent the morning hunting. When the sun struck 12 and the earth became too hot, he returned to the cave with his prey and prepared a lunch. In the afternoons, he sat by the stream and threw pebbles, watching the ripples that formed and collided with each other. In Teneb, the absence of Corenitus was discussed. Some said that in one of his experiments he had evaporated. Others thought that in his madness he had thrown himself into some abyss. Only Pornius knew that his master had gone in search of his image. The storm was furious. Corenitus had never seen anything like it. The thunder shook the inside of the cave, and the lightning seemed to set his entire body on fire. He saw his hands covered in scars and marks caused by fire, acids, and aqua regia. The storm painted them an electric violet. He touched his face. Despite the cold, he was sweating. His hands began to tremble. Corenius felt his stomach tighten. He had heard others say that fear made the stomach sweat, tremble, and contract. He thought for a moment and realized that for the first time in his life, he felt fear. It's an unpleasant sensation, he thought. It's inside me like a leech attached to my stomach. I can't believe it's caused by the storm. It's just a natural phenomenon. Corenius trembled. He lay down on his bed of leaves and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. It was too intense, too much light, too much noise, too cold. He remembered Paracelsus and thought he saw the flask fall and shatter as it hit the ground. He felt fear and began to shout with joy. Anyone who had seen that human figure emerge from the cave in the middle of a storm and begin to dance and thank the thunder would have thought it was a ghost, a madman, or a wild beast in human form. Corenitus was grateful for the rain. He had never felt such joy. Her desire to see herself through Pornius's eyes had disappeared. All that remained was the feeling of having experienced fear and having understood. Janioswai, or was a very mature leader and had never allowed panic to spread among his people, and he wasn't going to start doing so now. It was true that the glare, the terrible noise, and the heat had managed to disrupt his characteristic state of serenity and the tranquility he had managed to maintain in his domain for more than 20 years. But all that was over, and now the only important thing was to rebuild the destroyed huts and put out the fires. The assembly of elders, gathered in the ceremonial cave, demanded explanations. What had caused the appearance of light, the tidal wave, the heat? Why had the sea changed color? Why, if or had said that everything was over, did the dead fish continue to appear and that ash continue to fall from the sky? Or he didn't know it, so he let the elders know, but he also showed them his disappointment at noticing that they hadn't learned that the world was much more mysterious and wonderful than this one. Any structure that attempted to explain it. The elders understood, and within each of them arose the certainty that Or was still the teacher and leader, since he made them learn. The next morning, the news was being talked about throughout the town. 2 human bodies had been found near the reef. One of them had severe burns all over his body and appeared to be dead. The other was still breathing, albeit very faintly. Or gave orders to take the survivor to the largest hut in the village, where he would receive proper care. Or's greatest pride was his meetings with the children. Every morning, all the village children came to Or's house, and for 4 hours they discussed their dreams, did imagination exercises, and talked about what they had learned the day before. Or told them that he had dreamed of his deceased father, who, in his dream, had pointed out the fruit of a tree, and taking it in his hand, had examined it carefully while eating it. This, Or told them, means that real knowledge is based on 2 processes. One of them is knowing, and the other is feeling. He revealed to them that in the dream his father had indicated this to him by taking the fruit, observing it, and eating it. Someone who knows, he said, is capable of knowing what surrounds them by observing the relationships of the observable, without at the same time ceasing to feel them. The children nodded delightedly. One of them mentioned that the day before he had experienced something similar to Or's dream. When he was making love with his little friend, he had understood that, or that penalty knows. That is why true wisdom only exists when it is understood and felt. A little girl recounted that the day before, she had realized that feeling had no limits, that they appeared when one fell into a routine pattern, and when one became a spectator of oneself. She had seen a flower. It was beautiful, and upon observing it, she had felt that she loved it. This sensation had become so intense that she began to feel afraid. At that moment, she stopped loving it, which showed that the feeling of love existed until the moment she began to think about the intensity of her feeling. Therefore, she would have continued if fear hadn't appeared, or thought it was wonderful to learn from children. What they said was the most profound and real. For Or, the day was highly stimulating. After the meeting with the children, he discussed philosophical issues with the elders. Today they would talk about certainty and its relationship to knowledge. After the discussion, Or planned to visit the survivor. What had happened? The elders were right to be worried. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Or thought that even if it was the worst, it shouldn't affect him. While he couldn't help feeling curious and worried, the survivor probably knew how his body ached. Every movement required a gigantic effort. He probably had some fractures, and certainly first and second degree burns. Janios tried to open his eyes. The light was scorching, and also that strange smell, a mixture of sweat, smoke, wet straw and urine. He began to remember. The view from the astronomical balloon was spectacular. The sea was an intense color. The atmosphere was clear, and not a single cloud could be seen. His companion was busy with the barometer when the radio transmission reached them. They only managed to hear the gasping and despair of the operator. And now, with those pains and the unpleasant smell, Or watched Janios, guessed his suffering, and felt his desperate effort to open his eyes. His body was muscular. The wrinkles on his face indicated a person of strong character and decisiveness. Or couldn't be sure, but he felt he would learn many things from the wounded man. Janios was amazed at Or's stature. He was a true giant. The look on that Goliath's face was strange. There was an almost phosphorescent glow in his eyes, and his expression was almost philosophical. Although his clothing suggested he was a primitive man, perhaps a member of a tribe that had not come into contact with civilization. Or asked him his name, and Janios's answer was a mixture of guttural sounds and high-pitched tones. They would have to teach him their language, otherwise they wouldn't be able to communicate. Or asked two of his children to teach the man how to speak. The meeting with the elders took place 6 months later. Janios had fully recovered, and his knowledge of the native language was sufficient to communicate easily with them. The meeting had been Janios's own idea. He'd seemed desperate and upset over the past 2 months. Everything he saw seemed to put him in a mood very close to a bad mood. On the few occasions when he did speak, he mentioned his disagreement with what was happening around him, and explained that many mistakes were being made. In the way children were raised, in the way they communicated, and even in the way they made love, right there in plain sight. When Janios spoke, everyone listened and smiled, but no one seemed to take him very seriously. The elders settled down to listen to Janios, or had asked them to be considerate, and not to forget that Janios had a history and inner experiences very different from those they shared. Janios began by thanking everyone for their kindness and attention, or noticed the confusion among his people. It was absurd for anyone to be grateful. It was true that Janios came from a very remote place, but his primitivism was exaggerated. Janios began to explain that in his hometown he was considered an authority for his knowledge and handling of science. It was inconceivable, or himself began to get worried. His children understood from the age of 4 that boasting about having knowledge only meant that it does not exist except as data, and here is a seemingly adult person who had not passed the age of 4. An elder began to speak, and Janios asked to be allowed to finish. This remark provoked such laughter among the council members that Or was forced to intervene. He made a sign that meant be patient, and the elders, smiling, understood. Janios didn't understand what was happening. He'd never imagined such a common request could cause such a scandal. The tribe was truly very primitive. He took a breath, smoothed his hair, and continued speaking. The science academies of 7 countries have named me an honorary member in recognition of my work. I'm telling you all this so you understand and don't misinterpret what I want to tell you. Or he felt dizzy. Asking the Council of Elders for understanding only meant that he was being questioned a priori. It was the ultimate insecurity and distrust. Mentioning the possibility of misinterpretation only meant that they were facing a being who he had learned nothing in his life and had been born and raised in a society in complete decline. The elders looked at each other, all feeling very sorry. Janios was sure that the reaction he saw was a sign that they had begun to respect him. He felt calmer and continued. I have noticed a number of errors in the way they are organized, and above all in how they educate children. Believe me, the only reason that leads me to communicate all these observations to you is the desire to help you. Or, with an ironic tone that deeply surprised the elders, asked Janios to be a little more specific. Precisely thinking about that, Janios replied, I will allow myself to mention some examples that I hope will not bother you. Or began to understand. Janios's belief that they might be uncomfortable only meant that he had been taught not to respect himself. It indicated a dichotomous mentality that could go so far as to be ashamed of his own actions. It was obvious. Only a person who has felt ashamed of what they do could think that others might feel the same way. Or stopped listening to Janios, wondering how to make the transformation. They had to teach him not to invalidate himself, and that would only be achieved by putting him in a position of being ashamed of his own actions. In touch with its essence. The first example refers to a scene I observed 3 months ago. The plan was simple but difficult to carry out. He would let Janios teach him his science, and little by little he would lead him to understand. All it takes is a dictator emerging from among you to turn you into slaves. I would create a seminary, invite Janios to teach, and the students would be him and the children. A society without laws and regulations ceases to be a society by definition. Laws prevent disorder, and prevent some from taking advantage of others. I would have to talk to the children, explain to them, and they would understand. The civilization I come from has much to teach you. If only you would allow it, it would show you how to achieve absolutely objective knowledge. Despite everything you're saying, you should be able to do it. It will be very difficult and tedious, but with the help of the children, it can be done. Janios had finished. He looked at the council as if waiting for an answer. The elders looked at or with an expression of astonishment, and as if asking him if it would not be better to ask Janios to return to his wonderful civilization. Or stood up, approached Janios, and placing his arms on his shoulders, turned to look at the elders. The look was sparkling and the expression smiling. The elders understood that, or had had an insight, or looked into Janios's eyes and said in the most serious tone of voice he could muster, "Tomorrow you will begin to teach us." The council was rejoicing. Janios had gone to rest, and/or was explaining to them what he would try to do. An elder began to speak. Today I understood that the lights, the tsunami and the dead fish were the work of people similar to Janios. We understand and approve of your idea, or we only ask that you be careful. If your attempt fails, we will all be responsible and we will understand that. or looked at the old man. He thought that the end of life was always connected to its beginning. He said to him, "Han, you surprise me. A 2-year-old child would have realized and understood better than you. Do not let something so simple impress you. Remember what you have done, learned, and you will never doubt." The children waited in the hut. Today they would receive their first lesson about science. While they waited for Janios, they pondered the meaning of that strange word. Or had told them that they would be coming into contact with a world very different from the one they had always known, and that he had absolute confidence that they would be able to understand and manage it. Janios showed up at exactly 8 a.m. Today we'll talk about the need for and importance of scientific knowledge. Science began the moment man posed a question and was able to resolve it objectively. "Do you mean," Sia asked, "that science consists of posing questions and answering them?" "What do you mean by objectively?" Clara asked. "What I want to show you," Janios replied, "is that posing questions and answering them is only a means to understanding and explaining natural phenomena. Objectively means that scientific knowledge is the same for everyone." The children began to grow restless. Although they remembered Or's words, they felt that Janios was very strange. Olaf rose from his seat and, looking at Janios, said, "When someone asks questions and seeks explanations, it means they already have them. If they do this in relation to nature, they make the mistake of thinking that nature will conform to its structures and forget that these are always narrower and simpler than the knowledge they wish to acquire. If they also think that this knowledge must be the same for everyone, they fail to take into account that each of those who form everyone is at a different stage of the path. To desire to teach the path, thinking they will be able to transmit it, is to fall into error. It makes the one who wants to teach think about teaching and stop living. The only possible teaching is that which arises from someone who is, and who therefore is not interested in teaching. Janios adopted the most peaceful position he could, and in a kind tone of voice he told them, "Whoever seeks explanations does not necessarily have them beforehand. He has simply asked himself a question, and does not trust his subjectivism to answer it. Therefore, who prefers to question nature directly? The knowledge he thus acquires may not be understood by some, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist independently of whoever understands it." Olaf insisted, "It's true that things teach, but knowledge is not in them, but in us. To distrust what you call subjectivism is equivalent to thinking that knowledge is external and distant from ourselves. The only knowledge valid is that which is based and sustained within us as long as it is free to know. Whoever seeks explanations knows that they exist, and also believes he knows the way to find them. Both the idea that they exist as well as the use of a path pre-established makes what is found adapt to the path, which prevents obtaining new knowledge since it is always different from the idea that one has of it. Trying to know new things based on what is already known prevents achieving such knowledge. Knowledge does not exist outside or apart from the one who knows. Therefore, if someone does not understand a knowledge, it does not exist for him. Since he is the one who gives value and reality to knowledge, the fact that it is not part of him necessarily implies that it does not exist." Janios scratched his head before answering. This did not please the children. They knew that the only knowledge that someone can to communicate is to communicate something that comes from a certainty. Or had never communicated anything he had doubts about, he preferred not to. But here was someone who had doubts, hence the scratching gesture, and who was nevertheless interested in talking. Janios sensed the children's distrust. For the first time since arriving on the island, he began to think that perhaps these people weren't as primitive as he had imagined. He didn't quite understand the reason for this feeling, but he didn't doubt it either. Of their reality, he decided to end the meeting for that day. Janios couldn't sleep. He felt a terrible emptiness and didn't understand why. He had to analyze it and find out where it was coming from. Otherwise it would only get worse, and the limit, he knew it, would be despair. Suddenly he understood. The feeling of emptiness had arisen in the moment when they had questioned the only thing he possessed. He had to show them the value of scientific logic. They might understand if he could find the right example. Suppose, Janios told the children the next day, that you want to know how a flower grows. The first thing you should do is understand its constituent parts. To understand them, you would need to use a method. We could dissect a flower and thus separate its components. Then we would have to take several groups of flowers and cut off a part from each one in order to find out which one produces growth. We could change the soil conditions, the temperature, or the humidity, and see how the flowers grow under the different conditions. Once we knew which parts of flowers are essential for their growth, and determined the environmental conditions where this is optimal, we would be able to understand how a flower grows. Clara asked, "At what point according to science should we experience the flower?" Janios replied that he didn't understand the question. "It's very easy," said Olaf. "If we wanted to understand the growth of a flower, we would first have to live and love the flower." "Now I understand," said Janios. "The wonderful thing about the scientific method is that it is not necessary to have that kind of experience to be able to understand nature and thus answer the questions we ask it." Almost in unison, the children let out a perplexed exclamation. "But if you haven't experienced a flower, how can you think you'll understand it? Besides, what's the point of such knowledge?" Janios began to lose patience. "What," he asked, "is the point of living a flower?" Luaf, the youngest of the children, began to speak. "Before I was born, you would not have been able to understand me. It was necessary for me to exist, so that there would be something to understand in me. The flower you speak of, you can only know it if you first let it bloom within you. First, you have to experience the beauty of the flower and then ask questions about it. If the flower doesn't exist within you, you can't understand it for the simple reason that understanding it also occurs within yourself." Janios's head began to hurt. He felt there was a misunderstanding somewhere, but he couldn't clarify its characteristics or origin. Almost pleadingly, he said to the children, "Please let me continue, and later you'll understand what I mean. The meaning that science gives to the knowledge of nature is independent of the aesthetic sensations and emotions experienced when perceiving the object of knowledge. The two should not be confused, as that only results in a loss of objectivity." "We don't understand you," said Olaf. "For us, knowledge is an experience, and that is its meaning. For you, however, experience does not exist." "I am not denying experience," said Janios. "I am only saying that the aesthetic sensation that occurs within me when I see a flower is independent of the knowledge I can acquire about it. The meaning of this knowledge is to satisfy my curiosity and give me the means to make bigger or smaller flowers, with or without colors, with smells or flavors, in short, to allow me to predict and control flowers or any other object around me. The ability to predict and control enables me to satisfy the needs of those who use or like the objects I know, be they flowers or fabrics." Olaf spoke again. "What's the point of making bigger or smaller flowers with more or less color, if you can have the most profound experience with one of the existing ones? What's the point of giving a flower more fragrance if at the same time you deny the importance of experiencing the fragrance? In short, what's the point of knowing without experiencing?" "But I ask you," Janios almost shouted, "what is the point of living without knowing?" Olaf understood what was happening to Janios. With the utmost delicacy he said to him, "What is happening to you is that you have never lived. If you had, you would know that knowing is only possible when one has previously lived." Janios did not answer. He looked into the void. Within a guttural voice, very quietly he said to Olaf, tell or to teach me how to live. Janios looked at the roof of the hut. The beams that held it up seemed to have been placed by someone for whom the order of things was of no importance. How could this happen to me, he thought. Everything was so clear and secure, and now… It only takes 2 sessions with some kids. Janios waved his hands as if painting semantic quotation marks in the air, for everything to come crashing down. The worst part is that no one seems interested in teaching me. I've been waiting for days, and he hasn't come. I would have reacted differently. In fact, I wanted to teach them. I wanted them to be happier. But they don't think about that. They just are interested in themselves. Janios hadn't left the hut for 15 days. The food was brought to him by the children or the women. They always arrived at the door singing or laughing. They hoped Janios would notice, but he seemed to be somewhat dull-witted. At the council meeting, as the case was discussed among the elders, some began to doubt that Janios would understand. Or, on the other hand, was certain that sooner or later Janios would begin to learn about himself. He said that someone who had so quickly perceived children as possessing something different would have to come to see it in himself. Janios was desperate. He felt like everything around him was hostile, and that he was to blame for it. He closed his eyes as if trying to push away the thought of running away. He knew that if he did, he would die. But it was impossible to stop thinking about running away, cutting some branches, building a raft, and launching himself into the sea. Suddenly, he saw a lake, a full orange moon reflected on its surface. The night breeze caressed its moisture, and on its banks, small bushes and milk-colored straws moved placidly, as if enjoying the freshness of the wind and the smell of water. The mountains surrounding the silver surface seemed to protect it from any accident. The water, the wind, the moon, and the mountains were a single construct. They were all part of Janios, and for the first time in his life, he perceived them that way. Suddenly, a fluttering of wings. A snowy white heron flew over the clear water, the movement of its wings a symphony. Janios began to sing a melody, which he realized represented flight and was incredibly beautiful, and it also came from within himself. The heron approached the surface of the lake, one wing brushing the water, creating a series of fantastic ripples that crashed against each other. Janios invented the melody of the heron in contact with the water. It was also incredibly beautiful, and represented his vision as if it were the heron itself. The heron floated in the water, its body moving with the waves, swirling or bobbing up and down with a gentle motion. The melody changed, becoming placid and joyful. The bird longed to dive into the liquid, took a deep breath, and disappeared underwater. The music became the freshness of touch. Janios could change the image and the music at will. Everything came out with unparalleled perfection. Everything matched, and everything came from within. Janios opened his eyes, understood the poet, the painter, and the musician, knew that he had lived, that Olaf was right. It was living that made one learn. He understood that it was simply a matter of letting his inner self manifest itself freely, without thinking, without analyzing. This, he told himself, is the only way to know something. You must first let it be born in order to then understand it. If it is not born and does not exist, there is no way to understand it, because there is no possible way to understand that which does not exist. Only that which exists can be understood. Or opened the door, approached Janios, and looked him straight in the eyes. Janios met his gaze and, with a smile, said to Or, "Thank you for not coming. Ako pilko sutavita." The meeting was planned for the evening, at some time. The building was old, the staircase dark with a metal railing. The apartment was on the second level and smelled of incense and patchouli. The floor was wooden. Books were placed on the floor, forming corridors around a center, 2 thin mattresses, one next to the other, and near them a rocking chair and an armchair. Joanne's paintings on every wall, a rigid hand covering a distraught face, a recently hanged man with the rope limp around his neck, a body wrapped in bandages and lit by the red reflection of 2 candles. 3 women, crying at the body, a blue face on a blue background, with a blue mask of his own death sticking out of his face. A deep-eyed, bearded man with his hair standing on end. A girl with gigantic eyes looked around with a frightened expression. "I like your paintings, Joanne, even though they seem sad to me." The red reflection on the bandaged body. "It's extraordinary, but they are very badly painted," she answered. "I still need to learn many techniques. I think technique is the least important thing. You create an atmosphere and convey what you want. Yes, but for that you need to master it, otherwise it won't work. You can see something before your eyes and translate it into paint, but if you don't master the colors and the brush, what you paint isn't your true style." Finya arrived half asleep. "Damn, I fell asleep at 4 in the afternoon and could barely wake up," she said. I asked them how they were. "Great," they replied. "We like the way we live, and we're not into the competitive vibe." The music was at medium volume. Cat Stevens was magnificent, and the 3 of us settled in to listen. The Suchavita monastery had just entered the twilight. The walls surrounding the cloister and the church took on a violet-orange hue. The valley was filled with the chirping of crickets, and the wind stirred the leaves of the trees. Trees that formed the pine forest that surrounded the monks' cells. Bach was playing on the old church organ. All the monks had finished dinner and were settling in to listen to the music. "The bad thing," Finya said, "is that when one begins to depend on an authority, one loses one's own decision-making capacity and begins to act within patterns and structures." "But that's very easy to avoid," Joanne said. "It's just a matter of being in a good mood, so no other people's mood can affect you." "Yes, but that's only if you realize your dependence," I said. "The problem is that many times it's not recognized in oneself, although it is in others." Finya began to get excited. "It's very curious," she said, "how one can be in the same bad vibes than the other, and can see the others but not his own. It seemed, I said, that man has a blocking mechanism that protects him from seeing himself but allows him to see others." "That's true," Joanne said, "but things change when you start to realize." Enrich had invited Sulio and Andre to his cell. The 3 of them sat around the wooden table and began to sip the tea Enrich had prepared for them. "I've been thinking a lot about the world around us today," Andre said. "I think young people don't know what they want. Perhaps we are the only ones who can survive the degeneration that characterizes the modern age." "Don't think so," Enrich said. "I think we're all searching, and that's a good sign." "Yes," Sulio replied, "but the search must always be a confrontation and never an escape. And with today's youth, interested only in getting high, spending their lives dreaming or achieving conquests and everything that entails, the only thing that will be achieved is chaos. What I don't understand is how they don't realize it. It seems they're capable of seeing what's around them and discarding it, but they don't see themselves." "You must remember," Enrich told him, "that man has a mechanism that blocks his own knowledge, but allows him to detect problems in the people around him. Authority," I told them, "is what often ruins us. We begin to depend on what we are told and distrust our ability to find answers." "It's true," Finya confirmed. "I remembered when I was in high school, I never left after attending a class. I often felt like going to the countryside to feel the fresh air and meditate on myself. But it was more important to hear the teacher talking about literature, or even about the custom of meditation among Eastern peoples, than to do it on myself. Now that I remember it, I can only think that I was very primitive." "I'm glad you realize that," Joanne told her. "I told you that back then, but you didn't understand. I think," Joanne continued, that even today we tend to rely on authority. For example, I know that the important thing when painting is my inspiration, but I still have the idea of going to ask my painting teacher about the way of doing things. Imagine, I told them, that if we, living the way we do, still have problems with authority, what will become of the people who belong to religious or military institutions? The tea was delicious, Enrich, Andre told him, perhaps because of the feeling of warmth I experienced when drinking it. I remembered that tomorrow we will have the meeting with the Honorable Director General of the Order. That's true, Enrich said. His Lordship always creates a sense of warmth in all of us. He's taught us practically everything we know. In a person like that, you can trust him. His words are the essence and wisdom. I have often wondered, said Solio, to what extent your Lordship represents an authority which by its very nature inhibits creative capacity. I believe that in your case, this process, which is so common to observe in the external world, does not occur. It appears a leader, and an entire people begins to blindly follow him, losing their self-sufficiency as a result, or an artist or a youthful figure emerges, and people begin to depend on his teachings and become dependent. But that doesn't happen with his Lordship. He is very careful not to provoke or create dependencies among the members of the order. The phenomenon of authority, Enrich said, is very interesting. Man tends to seek out authorities who give him security. When he finds someone who represents his theoretical ideals, he falls under their aegis. And the worst part is that he rarely realizes the fall and the dependency that is created when it occurs. Why do you use the theme of death in your paintings, Joanne? I asked. It's just that, he explained. It's the moment when you realize the path you've been on because you've reached its end. Before that, you don't know what's going to happen to you. We have the impression that there are paths that we travel, I said, but do they really exist? I think, Finya replied, that they are more circuits than paths. They get shorter and shorter, until suddenly they disappear, and that's when you are in the good vibes. It's all about learning from life, from what you do, I said. You have to let out what you have to realize that it exists, and you also have to know other realities, because that's how you realize your own. That's the beauty of Mota. I've learned a lot from her. I think, Joanne said, that you don't learn or teach anything by using it. It all depends on how you use it, I replied. If you think you're just going to listen to beautiful music and that's all you do, you don't learn. But if you turn everything off and start watching yourself, you do learn. Besides, it's a matter of being with the right person. I've learned a lot. The other day I realized, by feeling it, that time doesn't exist. I'd see something and it was new, then I'd see something else, and it was also new. Everything was new. It only existed in the moment of seeing it, because it was created in that instant. That taught me that time doesn't exist. Last time, I realized that what I saw and heard were by themselves. That is, that the images had an existence, and that I was the one who constructed them. You're right, Finya admitted. We too have learned so much that it can't be expressed in words or gestures. What you learn, Joanne added, is very difficult to convey. Its reality and subtlety are yours, and a word or phrase doesn't contain them. It is obvious that the state of mystical ecstasy, said Enrich, is not transmissible. I wish it were, because then no one would fight or be jealous. It's true, Sulio confirmed. What one feels in those moments can't even be translated into words. But if that's so, Andre said, how can we know that it exists in the other? And besides, how does it have a name and a designation if it can't be transmitted? The fact that we call it mystical ecstasy, Enrich replied, is only a symbolization that allows us to communicate. Of course, it would be absurd to give a name to something that no one has ever felt the same way. The fact that it has a name doesn't mean that it's a sign. It indicates that it can be transmitted, It only means that it has coincided in several and a name has been given to it to signify the coincidence. But then, how can we communicate? I said, if it's not possible to transmit what one learns. It's very simple, Joanne replied. We can't communicate in the sense of transmitting experiences. All we can hope for is coincidences of experiences. It's very interesting, Finya said. How with weed you become sensitive, and ideas begin to coincide in such a way that you can communicate. What happens in those moments, I pointed out, is that one frees oneself from seeing oneself, one becomes uninhibited, and what is within oneself comes out, without blockages, without considerations, without agreements. This is what allows one to communicate. Of course there are methods, Enrich affirmed. If there weren't, the monastery would have no reason to exist. Remember what happens when we pray in the cloister or in our cells. We forget about impediments and considerations. We simply pray. We just pray, and that makes us free. It increases our sensitivity, and we unite with the universe. Remember His Lordship's teachings. It makes us feel in communion with man and with God, and that accelerates and allows us to have experiences like those associated with the so-called mystical ecstasy. Of course, Cilio said. It's not that transmit, but only that we accelerate, in all of us, their occurrence, and that makes them begin to coincide. If you breathe very deeply and very often, and then draw the smoke into your lungs, you get the best effect. Joanne said, That's true, Finya admitted, but that makes you feel the most dizzy spells in the world. The cigarette was about to burn out, so I took one last drag and put it in the ashtray, putting it out. We'd agreed not to play music and to leave the purple light on. Don't look so directly into the light, Finya advised me. You can damage your eyesight. Joanne is beautiful, I thought. She has an intangible mystery. Her paintings, her rings and her necklaces represent death, but this adoration is the simple but profound desire to know the way. It is the idea that everything is different from one moment to the next, and that only at the end can one know the reason, and why everything happened as it did. Past. Without realizing it, I began to speak out loud. Wanting to know what will happen only prevents it from happening. Believing that halfway through the journey you can know the why of it is lacking. Only at the end is it possible to see everything, for the simple reason that then nothing new will happen. It's what I told you before, Finya said. We move in many circles simultaneously. Some have already been resolved and have disappeared, but others are in progress. Don't confuse what's resolved with what remains to be resolved. The Director General of the Order stepped up to the pulpit and began to speak. Dear brothers, today we will talk about how we must be pure in order to know the essence of God. Being pure does not only mean doing good things, but more than anything it consists of being free from envy, evil and cowardice. It implies a profound self-knowledge and discarding one's own personal history. Purity is only possible when evil does not ferment itself, and when within each one of us we love him as much or more than the soul. Exterior. How is it possible that we are sometimes unable to see everything that is around us? Finya exclaimed. We buy a candle and leave it forgotten on a chair without ever remembering to admire it or at least look at it. We think that there must be more important things than seeing it, or observing a flower, a stone, or a tree. Tree. That's how they teach us, Joanne said. They tell us we have to be this or that we have to excel or study, and they make us think that only if we do that will we be valuable. On the other hand, if we see a candle or a flower, we are nothing. That's what we begin to believe, and that's why we don't admire everything that exists around us. Sometimes I'm like that with my painting. I think I should spend my life painting, and that I have no right to do anything else, because that would be a waste of time. The truth of the matter, I said, is that you should wait for inspiration to come, and only then paint. Doing it purposefully and fearing to waste time on something else is no good. I know that, Joanne replied. But how do we achieve it? We need to be pure, I replied, that is, free. And that can only be achieved by believing that what we feel is valuable. If we feel like resting, doing so is valuable. If we feel like looking at the stars, it is valuable. It's all a matter of trusting ourselves. The monks listened with concentrated attention. His lordship continued speaking. God is in everything that surrounds us. He is the method and the goal. But to reach him, we must reach ourselves. If we do not do so, we will never understand. We must try to channel our efforts to that self-knowledge, because only in this way will we, with God's help, be able to put the world back on track. Our world is in full decline and degeneration. Young people are only concerned with achieving pleasure and don't mind trampling on all known values. Joanne had a bright and deep look. She lay back on the mattress and began to speak. The greatest pleasure lies in self-knowledge. Nothing exists outside of that, and to achieve it, it is necessary to live. It is necessary to see it freely in what we do, and that only happens when what one is manifested, and that being is accepted as what it is, without hiding, without hypocrisy. Joanne, I interrupted, I really want to hug you. What did you say? He asked. I really want to hug you. Enrich was excited. His lordship's words made him very happy. He dared to ask a question. I would like the world to realize and accept love. I would like to leave Suchavita and transmit this certainty, but I am very afraid to do so. What does that mean, Your Honor? It only means that your certainty is not such, that your knowledge is intellectual and logical but not experiential. If it were, you wouldn't be afraid. Finya and Joanne were astonished. Finya looked at me with pitying eyes and said, You've thrown me off guard. Why did you say what you said and not do it? If you're willing, in your own words, it's valuable, so why? I was scared, Finya, I replied, scared that it wouldn't match. Enrich meditated in his cell, feeling very sad and distressed. His lordship is right, I thought. There is something missing. I understand it and I like it, but I am afraid. That only means I am insecure, but how could I not be? I got up from my seat, walked over to Joanne and hugged her. It's a delicious sensation, I thought. Touching her is like smelling a flower. Enrich rose from his chair, took his coat and after saying goodbye to his lordship, went out into the world. Look what I found! Finya almost shouted. In this book there's a poem about me, written by Russ. You have the essence of the feline, you lick your wounds alone so as not to be filled with evil. How I love Russ, he has incredible depth, and also describes me as I am. That's true, Joanne said, that's just how you are. Joanne, I said, you look sad. It's not sadness, he replied. It's the worry of not being able to transmit my waves. It's that it's useless. One cannot communicate them. I say things my way, and sometimes people are so stupid they don't understand. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop saying them the way I want. I don't have to change or make myself understood, he continued. It just agrees or it doesn't agree, that's all. It's that people, said Finya, don't want to understand. If they wanted to, everything would coincide. The thing, Joanne replied, is that some people have no dignity. It's so easy to tell when someone lacks it. It's always pitiful and infuriating to see someone like that. Let's hear Stephen's, I suggested. It's depth and beauty. Of course, Finya replied happily. It's the best. You know, Finya, Joanne said, I wish he was with us. I don't know if it's because I want him to be, or because he should be. I think, Finya replied, that he would be fine here. If you feel he should be, it's because it would be good for him to be here. We would really like him, Joanne said, for you to meet him. He's the coolest guy. He's probably at the shack in Acapulco, Joanne said. I heard there was going to be a blowout there. How about we go? What's a blowout? I asked. I can't explain it to you, Finya said. You have to experience it. Come on, please, Joanne asked. The road was delightful. The trees along the road were barely visible, and the car seemed to glide on clouds. The hut was cozy. There was a small room with a fireplace, and the warmth was comforting. Finya and Joanne's friend was there, as if waiting for us. Hi, he said. How cool that you came. We were thinking about you a lot, Joanne explained, and we wanted to share our feelings with you. I wanted to be with you too, he said. I was watching the fire and listening to music, and I gave you very strong vibes. It's great that you came. What's your name? I asked. I am Enrich, he replied. And you? Zero. The visitor was awaited with a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Al-Harisi had ordered 2 lookouts to be on the lookout for any signs that Janijaba was approaching. On the 3rd day, one of the lookouts reported having spotted a column of smoke that seemed to be moving in the direction of the royal palace. Al-Harisi immediately summoned the director of the kingdom's mathematical seminary and, locking himself in the royal chamber with him, explained the significance of Janijaba's imminent visit. Janijaba's greatest joy was traveling across the desert. The sand had taught him what men had been unable to, despite their eloquence and use of language. He had been banished from Arabia twice, pardoned by the Caliph himself. No one had bothered him for 5 years, and now Al-Harisi was urgently asking him to come to the royal palace. Nothing good, thought Janijaba, would come of this visit, but refusing would mean certain death. During the time of Caliph Ibrahim, Janijaba held the position of director of the mathematical seminary, and in that position, he had developed a complete evolution in the conception of numerical interactions. It was precisely for this reason, and during that memorable session of the seminary's board of directors, that it was decided to banish him from the kingdom for the first time. It was paradoxical how such a notable development in mathematical thought had encountered such opposition, especially when that same conception was already accepted as obvious. The second banishment occurred that same morning of the 2nd month, when Janijaba was found in his bedroom, taking measurements of the Caliph's favorite wife, to use them as data to formulate the perfect geometric relationship for a woman. It was considered, unfairly of course, disrespectful, and a humiliation to the royal family, and Janijaba thought that now it would be the 3rd exile. A line of thoroughbred Arabian horses with their riders came out to welcome Janijaba. At the entrance to the palace, the Caliph's personal guard was ready to give the royal salute. When Janijaba arrived at the doors of the marble building, the Caliph, on foot, went out to greet him. That night, the entire harem was placed at the disposal of the former exile mathematician. At 8 in the morning, a special envoy from Al-Harisi came to wake him and serve him. At 10, Janijaba was savoring a delicious breakfast, sitting by the crystalline fountain in the living room of the palace. At 12 o'clock sharp, Janijaba was led to the royal apartments where the Caliph and the director of the mathematical seminary were waiting for him. They sat on cushions around a round table. The room received abundant sunlight, but the atmosphere was cool, for the ingenious architect of the palace had devised an excellent ventilation system. Al-Harisi took a breath, and after giving his best smile, he said to Janijaba, I called you for 3 reasons. The first is that I appreciate you very much and have missed your presence. The second is because the development of the concept of numerical interaction has suffered a setback and is at a standstill. It just so happens that you, its inventor, will have to get it out of the rut. The third reason, this is a dream I had, and only you can interpret it. I dreamed that time, measured with an hourglass, stopped, but I kept thinking. When I realized this, Time began to move on, and I was amazed at how little time had passed and at the enormous amount of thought and ideas I had had in that time that hadn't passed. You must tell me the meaning of the dream, as well as your other assignment. Yani Jabba was resting in his room, looking at a flower and trying to understand the Caliph's dream. It occurred to him that something similar to the dream could be happening to him. He was looking at the flower, and that vision had no time. Moreover, if the vision were divided into an infinite number of parts, each one remained a flower. There would come a time when the number of divisions would be so great that the size of each would be very small, and yet the vision of the flower would not change. If the divisions continued, each one would be a nullity, and yet the vision would remain the same. This meant then, Yani Jabba rejoiced, that nullity exists. Yani Jabba sent word to the Caliph that he had found the solution to his dream, and at the same time had discovered that which would allow the concept of numerical interaction to continue developing. At 12 o'clock sharp, Yani Jabba was brought into the royal chamber. The solution to your dream, Yani Jabba told Al-Harisi, is very simple, and paradoxically, it's the same one required for the conception of interactions. It's the acceptance of nothingness as reality. It's the invention of a new mathematics, that of the existing nullity. To help you understand, I'll give you an example. Imagine a hollow sphere. Its interior contains nothing, it's nullity, but that interior exists because it's part of the sphere. In other words, it's the existence of nullity. We'll call it zero. The observatory. The observatory is built on asteroid 105,925H. As you approach it from the periphery, you soon begin to recognize a white dot nestled in a dark mass. At a sufficient distance, you can begin to make out the dimensions of the gigantic building, a white sphere in the center, with 4 arms built in the shape of cylinders. When you descend into the asteroid and, after checking all the controls, you lower yourself to the ground, that's when you suffer the shock. It's an incredibly large building, so large that you feel like it's going to crush you. But it's only when you enter one of the cylinders that the impression starts to slip away. The decor is certainly very modern, but it's almost like a home. As you approach the central sphere, you begin to notice a strange blue-violet glow. The moment you lean over the railing, Scarlatti's music begins to play, and when you turn to the center of the sphere, you see the world you come from. And the world becomes large or small, and when it's large, it's there. And after seeing that without understanding it, you take a few steps and find yourself at another railing. When you lean over, there in the middle of the sphere is a whole galaxy. And other steps, and another railing, and there the entire universe is there. That's when you decide. You jump into the center of the sphere, and along the way you pass worlds and stars, all because you're heading for the center of the sphere. In that instant, one becomes a universe. One sees oneself as separate from many others who live in other worlds, but at the same time, one realizes that one could be any of those beings, and that what truly matters is the universe that one creates and builds. It is discovered that each step can mean another universe, and that entering it only depends on a change in the point of reference, that of son, brother, husband, father, house, town, city, country, continent, world, solar system, constellation, galaxy, universe. At that moment everything is covered because everything begins to be within one. The observatory is a gigantic building on asteroid 105,925H. Once you enter it, the universe becomes one. Of the internal construction of the world. Watch the fire burning in the fireplace of your home. Burning logs have no light or heat in themselves. The movement of the flames and the tongues of fire do not exist as such. You are the one who creates and perceives the heat, light, and movement of fire. You are not the creator of the molecular and atomic interactions of what you call fire, nor do you create the chemical transformation, but the heat and light you feel. They are produced only within you and are your effect. You don't create the cells of the tree in your garden, but you do create the green of its leaves and the coolness of its shade. You don't create the electronic movement of the atoms in the water molecule, but you do create the coolness of its touch and its crystalline character. You are not responsible for the fermentation of vinegar, but you are responsible for its sweet, sour, and aged taste. What surrounds you suffers in yourself when you perceive it. 2 transformations. The first occurs when your nervous system transduces external energy changes into electrical activity in the neurons of your brain. Electrical activity is the same regardless of whether the external energy causing it is the movement of photons, changes in air pressure, or increased collisions of electrons. The second transformation occurs when electrical activity gives rise to a subjective experience of light, sound, or heat. Light, sound, or heat do not exist in objects. You are the sole creator and responsible party for their existence. And reality. From this point of view, the world as you perceive it is just a description. If our brain were constructed differently, the description would be different. If, for example, the visual pathway ended in the auditory cortex instead of the visual cortex, and vice versa, we would see sounds and hear lights. That would be the world for us, and we would come to consider it as real and beyond us, as we now consider seeing lights and hearing sounds. If we could transform ourselves into an insect, a bird, or a fish, we would realize that the transformations are different, and therefore, so are the descriptions. Realizing that the world is only a description doesn't mean discarding it, but simply accepting it as a product of a personal construction. From feeling important. When we are children, adults see us as helpless, immature, and lacking in knowledge. They perceive us as beings who require guidance and a teacher. Because of this, they feel entitled to teach us. First, they convince us that they, and not we, are the only ones who can decide and know. They instill in us that we are taught the idea that we are incapable and ignorant, and that we require guidance and advice. Little by little we assimilate this teaching and begin to need guidance and a teacher. The process is complete when we internalize the other, and their physical presence is no longer necessary. At that moment, it is the other within us who decides and must be heeded. Their teachings are followed to the letter, and worse, we forget that it is the other within oneself who decides, and we rather think that it is we who decide. The internalization of the other is not only done in terms of particular and concrete teachings, but, above all, in the consideration that the other is always right, and is always observing us. We become observers of ourselves through the internalization of the other as an observer. The observer is not, in reality, oneself but the other within us. To be a spectator of oneself is, in reality, to be observed by the teachings of the other. Our insecurity and dependence arise from this internalization. Our lack of freedom internal has the same cause. The consequences of the internalization process are disastrous. First, we learn to be observers, judges, and evaluators. Since others are always right in their judgments, and we ourselves are not, we try to conform to the expectations that others have instilled in us, which leads to behaviors that attempt to adapt and satisfy the hypothetical judgment and the evaluation we are subjected to. Secondly, we think that everyone around us is only interested in observing us. We think we are so important that others have nothing else to do but watch and judge us. This has an absurd and paradoxical consequence. Each person thinks they are being observed, and therefore conforms to that observation, when in reality, we are all contemplating ourselves through the internalization of the other. adapting to the supposed observation and judgment of the other, when in reality the other is busy seeing themselves and not observing us, creates a false and redundant situation where the only reason and motive for the relationship between oneself and the other is to maintain the teachings of the internalized other. Third, it creates a constant feeling of insecurity and a struggle to stay in line with our internalized teachings. The moment we do something that doesn't fit with our internalization, or even just think about it, we fall into conflict and despair. Fourth, we stop learning about ourselves because all we do is analyze our future and past behaviors in terms of whether they were or will be in accordance with the teachings, and rarely in terms of the behaviors themselves. Fifth, we stop learning from others because we only see them as observers of ourselves and never as separate entities. In sixth, we stop feeling, since any feeling that might not correspond to the internalized structure is rejected and blocked before it even appears. Above all, we cease to be free, because we believe there is a predetermined path to which we must adhere and to which we are committed, of opposites. When we mention the existence of something, we simultaneously create its non-existence. When we use the concept of goodness, we simultaneously construct the concept of evil. When we are aware of our experiences, we invent their absence. When we perceive life, we see death. When we discuss being and its essence, we talk about non-being and its correlations. When we are spectators of ourselves, we are the architects of not seeing ourselves. When we remember that we have memory, we construct amnesia. When we argue about wealth, we create poverty. When we feel old, we remember our youth. When we predict the future, we construct the past. All our values and concepts, as verbal constructions, entail and result from their opposites. The concept of movement can only be handled and understood if one understands the motionless. The consciousness of pleasure only exists when it arises from the consciousness of pain, which means that opposites result from a single construction and appear simultaneously and inexorably at the moment we categorize and analyze any experience. The simultaneous construction of the opposite is a verbal necessity, but it is not included in pure experience. In other words, the experience itself, without analysis and evaluation, is unique and self-existent. However, its verbalization is only comprehensible when it gives rise to and results from the understanding of its opposite. This, which might seem like a mere formal and academic analysis, is more real than a primary need. To demonstrate this, it is enough to recall that the concept of need would not exist if the concept of satiation had not previously existed. A physical object is considered real as long as several observers agree on it. If the rose that someone observes is also seen by several observers, that person is certain that it exists. It doesn't matter if the experience of the rose is different for different observers. What matters is that they all assign the same name. Similarly, a fact is accepted as true as long as it is considered so by a culture, a society, a group, or at least more than one acceptor. This is what has been imposed on us as a teaching, and its power is such that anyone who manages to escape it is considered as sick. Our society places the utmost value on situations of agreement. Such an assignment wouldn't be so serious if it were limited only to what we call the physical world. The seriousness of the matter is that it isn't limited to that world, but, on the contrary, is transferred to the internal world. If someone has a dream, that dream is considered unreal, since there is only one observer. When someone has an idea or a thought, they feel the need to communicate it, not to transmit it, but to achieve consensus. If such consensus isn't achieved, the idea or thought is invalidated. The parts of our internal experience that are not accepted by others are no longer accepted by ourselves. Their reality and value depend on the agreement we manage to establish. We are slaves to others, and this prevents us from being free. It's only when we begin to respect ourselves, that is, when we know that the reality of our internal experience doesn't need to be validated by agreements, that we begin to be free. The reality of an experience is contained within the experience itself, never in its acceptance, validation, or appraisal by others. Someone might ask what happens when one makes the assessment oneself. The answer is unequivocal. Such an assessment does not exist within us. It is always the result of others, in this case, of others internalized within us. Of the inheritance. To play is to express something that isn't directly related to what one feels. In play, there is a separation between overt behavior, that is, the reality that others can share, and internal reality. Humans aren't the only ones who play, lower animals do too. In a captive cat colony, the dominant feline attacks the other members when, being very hungry, someone offers them food. The cause of the aggression, in this case, is very different from the aggression itself. The only way to achieve its goal is to keep the other cats away from food. This is nothing more than a game. The behavior that many animals use to defend their territory is not very different from the one described above. The silverback gorilla has learned that its appearance is so impressive that it simply beats its chest or stamps its foot, while gesturing to scare away any potential enemy from its territory. The desire to conserve territory is very different, in and of itself, from the behavior it gives rise to. In this particular case, the gorilla is playing at being very aggressive, having learned that this is the way to ensure the survival of his colony. Again, the overt behavior is distant and detached from its true purpose. The gorilla is very peaceful. It almost never uses physical force to achieve its goals. It is enough for it to manifest behavior that other animals interpret as aggression despite, or perhaps because, its internal reality is contrary to this manifestation. Animal play is always related to a primary need for survival. It is this need that drives and motivates them to play. Between what the animal feels and what it acts upon, there are a series of mediating processes that form a bridge or connection between internal and external reality. This connection is established through a learning process and is always the result of the desire for survival. Man has fully developed his capacity to build mediating bridges. It is a legacy he has preserved intact, although in most cases it involves, and is rooted in, an internal insecurity that he wishes to diminish. The man who expresses love when he actually feels hate, or the man who acts as if he feels an emotion, when in reality he has no affect, plays these games for at least two reasons: A, to defend themselves against their feeling of helplessness and insecurity, and B, to avoid causing harm. The person who plays motivated by the first reason is characterized by their tendency to use people as objects. The person who plays driven by the second is characterized by their naivete. In both cases, however, a mediating connection between what is felt and what is manifested. Man, like the lower animals, develops this connection as a result of previous learning, and therefore learns to express something very different from what he actually feels. But, unlike animals, he is driven in his games by a series of theoretical considerations that are very different from what actually provokes them, and from what they arise from, and what they give as a result. Man is not the games he plays, and therefore, he is capable of realizing his existence, and above all, of discarding them. When he succeeds in doing so, he not only discards his entire personal history, but also distances himself from his heritage. This process causes a change of state, characterized by the passage from absolute determinism to self-determinism. The approach to self-determinism leaves all processes of representation, creativity, and internal freedom that the human brain is capable of mediating. which has the effect of bringing the human being closer to his essence. From internal experience. There are two reasons that drive someone to impose structures and establish agreements. The first comes from the desire to give more reality to an internal experience. Getting someone to have the same internal experience through a process that involves gaining access to an agreement and incorporating a structure, it makes us feel that for this reason, it acquires a quasi-physical reality. This process is a simple transfer of learning that consists of considering a physical fact as real if, and only if, several observers agree that it is. The second reason is the desire to share an internal experience. What a subject feels, the states of serenity, anguish, depression, love, etc., have a character of such intensity in terms of their existence and reality, that it is difficult to think that the person or people with whom one establishes a relationship do not have the same feelings. Phenomenological experiences. Knowing whether they truly have them is always a difficult question to answer. It is precisely this difficulty that drives us to take measures aimed at forcing others to incorporate these types of experiences. The idea that an experience can be transmitted through the use of pressure methods is absolutely absurd. In most of these cases, the only thing achieved is an external manifestation that indicates that the experience has been had, without that it has actually been successfully transmitted. Only in some cases do imposition techniques succeed in changing the internal experience. Techniques commonly known as brainwashing can achieve this, however. The result in other areas is disastrous for the subject. Commonly, the person who wants to impose an internal experience is satisfied when the person to whom it is imposed shows external signs that indicate success in the imposition, which is very contradictory and absurd, since the only thing that is achieved is a manifestation that is nothing more than a deception, and not the internal experience that was intended to be conveyed, and yet that satisfies the imposer. The above indicates that the desire to share an internal experience is just another game. Sharing it or not sharing it may or may not happen, but it is never the result of exerting pressure on the duration of the changes. We tend to think that change in a person takes a long time to occur, that it is always partial and only related to a restricted area of the so-called personality. Nothing could be more false. The process of change is completely separate and alien to the temporal dimension. Change only occurs when it is occurring, and that occurring is always in the now. Therefore, it neither lasts a long time nor a short time, it simply recognizes no time. When someone discovers a new dimension, that's when they change. The discovery happens in an instant. Before that moment, there was no change, so that change exists only in the instant in which it occurs. To think that what happened before that moment is part of the change is to accept the existence of nothingness. In a certain science fiction story, it is told of a great inventor who discovers the time machine after committing a murder. It occurs to him that the best way to avoid the punishment of justice is to go back in time. In doing so, he relives his entire life up to the moment he committed the murder and invented the time machine. Again, it occurs to him that his salvation lies in going back in time. In doing so, he relives his life up to the moment he committed the murder, invented the time machine, and went back in time. This entire circle continues ad infinitum and for all time. The situation preceding the change is similar to this infinite circle, that is, to nothingness. Therefore, it does not exist. When change occurs, it is neither partial nor restricted, but rather a total and absolute renewal, where everything is modified and nothing from before remains. Perhaps that's why change is so difficult. There's an intense desire for everything to stay the same. There's a fear of change because it's known to be complete. The person who changes travels through a gradient, in which the first modifications occur in short intervals and are relatively simple. Later, the changes become more spaced out and become increasingly profound and complete. There comes a time when change can only mean total and absolute renewal of the enemies. Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan states that, to be free, man must overcome 4 enemies: fear, power, age, and clarity. The reason for the first 3 is relatively easy to understand. The man who is afraid to discard agreements, who depends on the power structure or feels old, is not free. Only when he overcomes these 3 enemies does he begin to be free. The enemy of clarity is more difficult to understand. With this term, Don Juan refers to those situations in which one relies on a logical theoretical structure or a series of preconceived ideas to explain the universe. Seeing things through a structure creates the sensation that everything is explainable and transparent, that everything is clear and easy. This type of clarity only leads to redundancy and a failure to learn. Therefore, it is an enemy that threatens inner freedom. Clarity can only be overcome when someone realizes that the only valid learning is that which teaches us that what can be learned has no limits, and that, therefore, apparent clarity is merely a prelude to new discoveries. Learning. How can we explain that someone simultaneously displays behaviors associated with dependence and submission, and on the other hand, with force and authoritarianism? The only way is to consider that the people who taught these games displayed the same dualities. The young child sees someone who is authoritarian, and also sees someone who submits to that authority. He learns dependence and submission from those who submit to the authoritarian, while he learns strength and power directly from the authoritarian. Learning, coupled with the fact that at the beginning of ontogenetic development we learn by imitating, means that the 2 tendencies are engraved in the person in formation. Authoritarian behavior is used for the same situations in which it was seen being used. Submissive behavior is applied and arises in the same situations that were associated with the submission of the other. It is only when we can reconstruct these experiences, and we can understand them, and we begin to overcome them. Of the children, the true desire to have a child only arises when you manage to overcome the feeling and experience of insecurity, and, therefore, when you are able to begin to give and receive. The parent-child relationship is only productive when both members are able to learn from each other. This occurs when the structure of being a parent is discarded, leaving only what is essential, and it is proper. A child should never be an object of use or a means of satisfying needs. He is a brother and companion who teaches and learns, and is therefore worthy of greater respect and admiration. The desire to make a child the same as the father or mother is merely an escape from one's own insecurity. It is the desire to establish an agreement and a structure. Anyone who is incapable of learning from a child should not have children. From learning. The only person guilty of not being able to learn is the one who doesn't learn, never what he teaches. The world is so vast and wonderful that not seeing it is always the result of blindness. Anything can teach. Raising one's head and seeing a mirror reflecting sunlight can be an automatic act, or it can give rise to infinite learning. This motor act can reveal the entire physiological structure of muscular activity, all the laws of optics, and the existence of the sun and its reactions. It can give rise to the ultimate perceptual experience and an entire phenomenological philosophy. Unfortunately, raising one's head is almost always nothing more than moving one's neck. Whether this is the latter or the former depends not on the movement itself, but rather on the freedom to understand it. This indicates that any event can become the ultimate learning experience, depending on whether the learner so desires, on the introjection of others, Being a spectator of oneself is based on the desire and need to be seen by others. In fact, seeing oneself and valuing what one does, says, or feels is always seeing oneself through others. A real experience is never accompanied by observation. The one who experiences it is oneself, and therefore self-assessment cannot exist. If this occurs, the experience ceases to be one and becomes a simple, redundant circular structure, which results in the loss of feeling. This is why events in which one has been a self-spectator are rarely remembered. Only real experiences are consolidated as memories. Remembering that one has been a spectator of oneself has no character, specificity, or reality, and therefore cannot be revised. However, lived experience has such power and knowledge that it is always remembered as such.